Welcome everyone once again. It's a new day and today we are going to be studying advanced audit. I have some previous lectures on advanced audit and assurance, and if you haven't looked at it, you should go look at it. It sets the foundation when it comes to audit, and I feel like it's really going to help you in terms of passing your exam. Advanced audit is a simple paper. I believe as I walk you through these lectures step by step, I'm going through the syllabus step by step with you so you can definitely pass your exam. So let's dive into the objectives for today. So today we'll be looking at professional standards. We'll be looking at money laundering. If we have some time, we'll be talking about compliance and other matters as well. And so stick and stay with me. It's going to be an exciting lecture as we go through all of these things. So let's talk about the international standard setting process, right? There's what we call the ISAs, which is the International Standards on Auditing. So the ISAs are set by the International Audit and Assurance Standard Board, which is a part of IFAC. IFAC, as you know, is the International Federation of Accountants. So the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board is part of IFAC. It's part of IFAC. Remember in the previous lecture, we talked about harmonization, where there's going to be a bridge between accountancy and audit. So you see here that the IAASB is a part of IFAC. It's a part of IFAC. So they work hand in hand, they work together. So a subcommittee of the IASB, which is the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board, is asked to write an exposure draft of the new standard. So anytime they are going to put out a new standard, there's supposed to be an exposure draft. So when we say an exposure draft, what does it mean? Basically, it's a draft that exposes. But what does that exactly mean? The draft of the new standard is basically, exposed to interested parties who will then comment and give feedback on the draft. So it's an exposure draft basically lays down, the parameters of a new draft and then seeks to give it to interested parties who will give feedback on it. So interested parties could be professional bodies, it could be national standard setters, all these people could be interested parties. So just remember that when you say an exposure draft is basically a draft that seeks to outline the parameters of a new draft and basically give perspective on what the new draft is about for feedback. So let's look at the different types of standards and when it's applicable. So you have the International Standards on Auditing, which is the ISAs, which we've already talked about. And this is applied in the audit of historical financial statements. In the audit of historical financial statements, you need to understand each standard and when it is applied. That's why I'm taking pains to walk you through all of this. You also have the International Standards on Review Engagement. And this is applicable in relation to the review of historical information. As the name suggests, right? International Standards on Review Engagement. It's applicable in the review of historical financial information. They also have International Standards on Assurance Engagement. This is also applicable in assurance engagements. But the key thing here is other than audits or reviews of historical information. So the International Standards on Assurance Engagement is applicable when it comes to in assurance engagements, except for or other than audits or review of historical financial information. Very key. They also have the International Standards on Related Services. So this is applicable for compilation engagements in relation to agreed upon procedures or other related service engagements. We talked about these things extensively in the previous lecture. So if you haven't watched it, please go back and have a look at it. It would help you to build the foundation for you to understand audits. Then the last one is International Standards on Quality Control. International Standards on Quality Control. So International Standards on Quality Control, it's for all the above services. All the above services we've mentioned, the International Standards on Quality Control applies. So what does this exactly mean? What does this exactly mean? Quality is important across board, whether you are doing an audit, whether you are doing a review, whether you are doing a compilation, whether you are doing agreed upon procedures. Quality is important. That's why we say here that it's applicable for all of the above services. I hope you get me. So this is something that you need to understand, you need to keep at the back of your mind. So let's move on to the next slide. So ISAs, which are International Standards on Auditing, are written in the context of an audit of financial statements by an independent auditor. Remember how we talked about independence and how it's critical. If an auditor is not independent, then the auditor is going to be biased. So independence is very key. But ISAs can be adapted, as and when necessary. But there are certain things that ISAs must contain, or the components of an ISA. It must have an introduction. It must have objectives. What are the objectives of this ISA? What is it trying to achieve? Then it has some definitions and some requirements, right? Some requirements as well, and explanatory material on how to apply this ISA and for guidance purposes as well. So these are some of the components of an ISA. When you see an ISA, you should be seeing things like an introduction, what it's trying to achieve, any definitions, and explaining the standard for guidance purposes and basically how to apply it correctly. Then you have other international standards. So other international standards are the ones we talked about in the previous slide. We have ISQCs. They apply to all services carried out under the IASB's engagement standards. The other international standards are ISREs, which is on review, ISAEs, which is on assurance engagement. But all these follow the format of the original ISAs. All these other international standards, the ones we talked about, if you remember, we talked about international standards on review engagement, we talked about international standards on assurance engagement, international standards on related services. All these kind of follow the format of ISAs. Very, very important to understand. They also contain basic principles as well. They also seek to guide, they also seek to explain, provide explanatory information about the standard. Then let's talk about the IASB's Clarity Project. What is this all about? What is this Clarity Project all about? So somewhere in October 2008, the IASB issued a final Clarity Project update. So when we say Clarity Project, what's it about? The name rings a bell, right? To make something clear. So what exactly were they trying to make clear? What exactly were they trying to make clear? So the Clarity Project was IASB was an 18-month program to comprehensively review and evaluate all of its ISAs and ISQCs to improve their clarity, to ensure that this standard is actually clear. Is it clear? Is it not clear? We would want to understand that. We would basically want to understand. They would want to understand whether it's clear, and therefore the IASB's goal was to make these international standards on audit a lot more clearer, to enhance easy application and consistency as well. So they did a whole lot of work when it comes to making these standards clear. And as we go through, we would be seeing, some of these things. And when it comes to the different ISAs, there are a lot of them, but we'll be touching on some of them. So let's start with ISA 200. What is the ISA 200? The ISA 200 has been revised to set out the overall objectives. What are the objectives of an independent auditor? And also explain the scope of an audit. So two things here. Number one, the overall objectives of the independent auditor. And number two, the nature and scope of an audit. The nature and scope of an audit. Very, very key. Very, very important to understand. Number one is what? Objectives of the independent auditor. Number two is the nature and scope of the audit. It also explains other things like the scope, authority, and structure of the ISAs, explains a whole lot. But these are the two main things that you need to understand that you need to understand. The ISA 200 also includes material explaining concepts related to an audit, such as things like professional skepticism, professional judgment, the inherent limitations of an audit. So it's talking about the objectives of an auditor and the scope of an audit. That's the purview of the ISA 200. So very, very important. Then ISA 210 is now required to perform specific procedures. It's about procedures when it comes to ISA 210 to establish whether preconditions for an audit are present. So we are looking at audit procedures here. So we look at things like determining whether the financial reporting framework used is acceptable. Is the reporting framework we are using acceptable? And we also try to obtain management confirmation with regards to their responsibilities. We touched on management responsibilities in the previous lecture. So if you haven't watched that, please take time to watch that. So the auditor, so ISA 210 or 210 is basically focused on audit procedures, and it helps to determine certain preconditions. And number one is whether the financial reporting framework used is acceptable and whether management has confirmed that it understands its responsibilities. Very, very key. Then let's move on to ISA 260. ISA 260. What is ISA 260 all about? What is ISA 260 all about? This is in relation to communication with those charged with governance. The people who are charged with governance, how do we communicate to them? So this standard is giving us an understanding of how to do that. How to do that. So what are some of the things we need to communicate? You need to explain significant accounting practices. You need to document matters that are communicated orally. So if you have a conversation orally, you need to document it. Audit is all about documentation. You need to also communicate any significant difficulties you had during the audit. And you need to communicate also any significant matters that are arising from the audit. So these are some of the examples of the things that ISA 260 is saying we should communicate. Communication is key, when it comes to audits and when it comes to auditing the financial statement. Then let's move on to ISA 265. This is about communicating deficiencies in internal control to those charged with governance, and management as well. This is a new ISA which is intended to improve auditors' communication of deficiencies in internal control, So here you need to communicate any significant deficiencies, and you need to communicate it in writing and describe the deficiency and its possible impact. Describe the deficiency. You are communicating to make it clear. It's all about clarity, right? So describe the deficiency and its possible impact. Very, very key. Let's move on to ISA 320. This is all about materiality. And remember, when we say materiality, an item is material if its omission or misstatement will significantly affect or sway decisions of users who are using the financial statement. So what are we talking about here? Here the definition of materiality was made a lot clearer, because sometimes materiality can be confusing, Materiality can be confusing. So the whole standard tried to make it clearer that materiality depends on the size and the nature of an item, which is judged based on the surrounding circumstances. Very, very important. So what might be material to one firm might not be material to another, based on the size of the firm or based on the nature of the transaction. Very, very important to understand. So what may be material to Microsoft will not be material to, a small company somewhere. Very, very key. Very, very key. Then also introduced a concept called performance materiality, which is a materiality level that is set below the overall materiality, just for safety and to ensure that no uncorrected misstatements go without go without actually checking it, or go without proper auditing of it. And we'll be talking about performance materiality a lot more into detail. So yeah, just take and stay with me. And in this standard as well, they also talked about revising. The auditor has the right to revise the materiality during the audit if he becomes aware of any information that, causes, creates the need to, modify the materiality level. Very, very important. So revising materiality during the audit, if the auditor becomes aware of information that would have caused him to initially have set a different threshold, basically. So these are some of the thoughts when it comes to materiality. Again, it helps to make materiality a lot clearer. Materiality depends on the nature and the size of the item, judged in the light of the surrounding circumstances. Very, very key. Very, very key. They also have ISA 402. ISA 402. What is ISA 402 all about? This is audit considerations relating to an entity using a service organization. So first of all, we need to explain what a service organization is. A service organization, let me give you a typical example, is where you have a company outsourcing a part of its operation to someone else. So a typical example is these days companies outsource their payroll function to another company. So that company provides a payroll service. They're a service organization in that regard. So they are providing a service to this company. So that's what makes them service organizations. And when auditors are auditing a particular client that is using a service organization, they need to understand exactly what this service organization is doing, their processes, and all that, their processes and procedures, because definitely their client is working hand in hand with them. And to, put out an effective audit, they need to understand exactly what is happening with the service organization. So you realize that there's an increased use of service organization, and this standard seeks to address that. The ISA 402 was revised to reflect the need to bring ISA into line with then it was designed to bring service organization in line with the risk assessment processes of the ISA. Very, very important. Very, very key. So basically here the requirements here is that the auditor must understand, how the entity uses the services of a service organization. It must also understand the controls that are being used, The controls that are being used are very, very key, because the controls are the processes, the internal processes. So the auditor would want to understand that. Very, very key. Very, very important. So these are some of the things that the auditor must keep in mind. One, they must understand what the service organization is doing and how their client is using the service organization. They must understand the processes, the procedures, the controls that pertain to the service organization, and because it definitely has an impact on their audit. Then let's move on to ISA 450. ISA 450. ISA 450 is basically talking about evaluation of misstatements. Evaluation of misstatements identified during the audit. So how do you evaluate misstatements? How do you evaluate misstatements? Very, very key. There are a number of requirements now. First off, you need to accumulate all the identified misstatements. Accumulate all the identified misstatements. Have a list of all of them. And also, you need to determine which ones are significant and which ones are not. Which ones are significant and which ones are not. So you determine whether the uncorrected misstatements are material. So which ones are material and which ones are not. Then you also have to document them, So you need to document the ones that are material. You need to document the ones that are immaterial as well. And basically you can evaluate based on that. So you have a list of your misstatements, and then you know which ones are material and which ones are immaterial, and you evaluate them based on that. You evaluate them based on that. Very, very key. Very, very key. So it's just basically breaking down your uncorrected misstatements and seeing which ones are material and which ones are not. Then you have ICAG 505, which is external confirmations, right? External confirmation. So this was in response to concerns that this area has to be more rigorous. So auditors wanted to maintain control over the confirmation requests, and they have a right to obtain further evidence to resolve doubts over the reliability of responses, over the reliability. So what are external confirmations? So let's say your client says they have $1 million in their bank account, right? They have $1 million. So you have to externally confirm. You have to go to their bank. You don't confirm internally. You go to their bank to say, hey, this client says they have $1 million cash in their account. Is this true? Then they confirm. So this standard is basically seeking to help auditors to gain control when it comes to confirmation requests, and also obtain further evidence if something is not clear to them. Then you have ICAG 540, which is auditing accounting estimates, including fair value, accounting estimates, and related disclosures. Accounting estimates is one of the very, very tricky areas because there's a lot of management bias manipulation when it comes to this area. So here, the standard here seeks to, introduce a lot more rigor and skepticism in this area, So first off, what are some of the things that the auditor needs to understand? He needs to understand how management, came about the estimate they are providing. What was the process? What was the thinking process for the estimate? Very, very important. The auditor needs to understand that. And the auditor also needs to review the outcome of accounting estimates. They have to review the outcome of accounting estimates. They have to review the outcome of accounting estimates in prior periods. So the estimates that were done in prior periods, you have to review the outcome. What was the impact, basically? What was the impact? What was the impact? And the auditor also needs to find out whether any of these estimates lead to significant risk. So basically, it's all about understanding, and seeing how, these estimates were used in the past and their impact, and also any significant risk associated with the estimate. The auditor has to be aware of all of that. Then we talk about ICAG 550, which is related parties. Related parties is a huge issue. Major corporate scandals, which include Enron and WorldCom, involve related parties in some way. So the ICAG here is a lot more focused on a risk-based approach. So here the new requirements are saying that you need to treat significant related party transactions as giving rise to significant risk. Basically, you should take related parties as a serious issue because it's likely to create some significant risk. There's a potential for fraud here or errors here. Also, we need to specify procedures to be performed when it comes to the area of related party. And also, the auditor here must understand the controls put in place around related parties. We want to know whether the controls that they've put in place, the client has put in place, is solid around the whole related party thing. Because if it's not good enough, if there are a lot of deficiencies in the internal controls related to related parties, then, it creates the opportunity for fraud. Then let's move on to ICAG 580. So here it's all about standards, like I mentioned. And so, that's basically how we are going to do it in this lecture. So here we are talking about written representations. This standard was revised to respond to concerns that the auditor may be over-reliant on written representations. So the written representations are basically from management saying that they understand their responsibilities and they are responsible for preparation of the financial statements, etc. So this standard introduces a number of changes. So the auditor has to obtain written representations about management responsibilities. We need to be clear that management have given us, clarity that they understand their responsibilities and they know what they are doing. And that management responsibility in regard to preparation of the financial statements is in regard with, the applicable financial reporting framework. So basically, the auditor here must receive these written representations about management responsibilities. Management must say that written that, they understand their responsibilities with regard to the preparation of financial statements, with regard to giving the auditor access to all information. Remember that we talked about this in the previous lecture, and so it will be good to go and watch the lecture to understand exactly what we are saying here. But ISA 580 is on written representations. Written representations about management responsibilities. Then you also have ISA 600, which is special considerations. Special considerations. This relates to audits of group financial statement, including the work of component auditors. So component auditors are basically auditors who do, a part of the work. So they are primary auditors and component auditors. So primary auditors have the lead over the entire scope of the audit work, but the component auditors do a portion of the entire audit work. So what are we saying here? The revised ISA introduces a number of new requirements where other auditors, when it comes to auditing of the group financial statements, So what are we talking about here? Here we are talking about deciding whether to accept or continue an appointment as group auditor. Very, very key. Another thing we also need to know here is obtaining an understanding of the group and its components. The ISA requires that you need to obtain an understanding of the group. As a component auditor, you need to know exactly what's happening on a broader level. You also need to understand component auditors, what they are doing as well, including their professional competence. Are they capable of doing the work you've assigned them? Are they capable of doing the work that's assigned them? So you see, understanding is key. Understanding is key. When it comes to the international standards of audits, the auditor must have a lot of understanding about the group, about the component auditors, about their professional competence, and also determining a materiality level for the group as a whole and for each component. So this is basically some tips when it comes to ISA 600. Very, very key. Very, very key. So the last thing we are going to touch on is ISA 620, which is using the work of an auditor's expert. The auditor is not an expert in everything. It's an expert when it comes to matters of audit, but there are times where they will need an expert, maybe someone like a valuation expert, a transactions advisor, to be able to do their work, So, they basically rely on what the expert has done. So here we are saying that experts could be used not only in relation to accounts balances, but also for the purposes of risk assessment. Risk assessment. Very, very key. Very, very key. So the expert has purposes in relation to risk assessment. You know, very, very important. The revised ISA is restricted to the use of an expert engaged or employed by the auditor. So here we are focusing solely on auditor's experts. So the auditor brings in an expert to do a certain portion of the audits that they do not have the competence in. You know, so for example, a valuation expert, somebody who's into valuing things, a transactions advisor, you know, all these people are experts. All these people are experts. So basically, these are some of the standards or international standards on auditing that we want to touch on. In the next session, we'll dive more into money laundering and compliance issues, basically. So stick and stay with me. So we have a WhatsApp group, and I would love for you to join, because if you have any questions, you can post it there. And that's where we post the slides. That's where we post, you know, we ask questions, and that's where we do our Zoom calls to answer any questions that you may have. We are here to serve you. We are here to see that you pass your exam. So, you know, subscribe to this channel if you already haven't, and hit the notification bell so that anytime I post a video, you will definitely get it. So thank you, and have an amazing, amazing day.